In this video, you're going to learn how to do a rebuttal speech. After the first crossfire, you'll have 4 minutes to deliver a rebuttal speech. Your goal is to refute arguments brought up by your opponent during their constructive speech and their first crossfire. Only when you're done refuting your opponent's arguments, you can choose to strengthen your own case by adding, say, additional arguments or further explaining some of your arguments. This is how it will look like on the flow sheet. Ideally, you can record all of your opponent's case, which involves their framework, their definition, all of their contentions, and the following claims. And on the other hand, your rebuttal should have a similar structure as their case. Ideally, for each of their claims, you can come up with one rebuttal refuting that claim. So in the end, your rebuttal speech should look something like this on your flow sheet. And later on, when you know how framework and definitions work, you can also dedicate a part of your rebuttal speech comparing both of your frameworks and also your definitions. But for now, we'll focus on this part of the rebuttal speech. In general, the format of your rebuttal speech should look like this. For each of the rebuttals here, so for example, for this part of your rebuttal, just this part of speech, it should have this structure. First, you'll start with "they said." You'll point out the point that you're trying to refute. So this is their point. But here you're claiming your own stance. So if what they said isn't true, what should be true? This will be your point. And because is the reason supported with evidence. And at last, therefore, will be the impact of this rebuttal speech. What does it mean if what they said is no longer valid, and what does it mean if now what you said is more valid? There are 4 ways to do this, and they can be abbreviated as DRMO, standing for deny, reverse, minimize, and outweigh. You should always select these strategies which strategies to use based on specific arguments from your opponents rather than blindly favoring one over others. So which one of the 4 you choose will be dependent on which argument you're trying to argue against. Firstly, you can deny their argument. That is, to argue that the argument is simply untrue. This can be targeted at either their evidence or warrants. When their source says something that is simply too good or too exaggerated, you can question their source and require them to show you where they got their information. Or if you have a more reliable source stating otherwise, you can prove their source false by comparing it to yours. When attacking their warrants, you should look for assumptions or logical fallacies that they made that are required for their argument to stand. So if you prove any of them invalid, anything that comes after that logical step no longer matters. For example, if your opponent argues that since cosmic radiation in space increases the chance of cancer, space colonization will be harmful to our health, then you can respond by breaking down a logical fallacy that they made. In this case, they're assuming that there's no way to defend ourselves against this radiation. So if you somehow prove that this assumption they made is false, then this link no longer stands and their impact no longer matters. So hopefully, if you have evidence, your rebuttal could sound something like this in the format. They said the space colonization harms our health due to cosmic radiation, but this does not propose a threat because we are already aware of this issue and, according to NASA, we're capable of creating suits that defend a human body against radiation. Therefore, people on space colonies will be able to live healthy lives. So since you have evidence from NASA saying that the assumption that they made is false, then they can no longer make this connection and their impact is no longer valid. The second strategy is called reverse. In this case, you should argue that the opposite of what your opponent said is true. Since you aren't denying their argument, you're already taking a step back and admitting that, although their evidence stands, their impact is not realistic. Since you aren't attacking the evidence or whatever warrants they add onto it, your choice here can be to add a piece of information, something your opponent failed to account for that reverses the impact. For example, if your opponent argues that international collaboration and space colonization leads to world peace, then you can bring up the point that resources and space create incentives of war, thus showing the judge that considering this factor, space colonization will probably cause war rather than peace. So here's their original argument. Given this piece of evidence, you're admitting that although only given this piece of evidence, the evidence itself is valid, and that their link between this scope, this view, and the impact is valid. However, what you can do instead here is to add another piece of information into the view. So here it will be the fact that resources in space can lead to more resource wars. So now you're reminding the judge that there's something not considered by the opponent that changes the final outcome of what this evidence implies. So here you're saying that, well, considering more information, it might actually cause more wars than peace. So you're reversing the original impact, and since you've proven the opposite to be true, what your opponent said is thus refuted. To minimize, you can take a step further back, acknowledge that their argument may have some validity, but argue that it does not matter as much as they say it does. Basically, you're attacking their impact. For example, their argument may be the UN is successful in maintaining world peace because of its successes in Mozambique. So their impact is essentially that the UN saved lives and it is significant. To minimize this, you want to compare it to something of much bigger magnitude. In this case, you can mention the UN's failures in most other operations, such as in Syria, Ukraine, and Rwanda. So you can show the judge that the UN's successes are minor compared to its general failure in peacekeeping. You want to show the judge that your opponent's argument doesn't really matter. Here you're showing that the UN's successes are too few that they're almost negligible. By providing overwhelming evidence that supports your side, you're minimizing the significance of the UN. The fourth strategy is to outweigh their argument with one of your own. This implies that you admit their argument is valid, but argue that it is less important than yours. Of course, this strategy naturally fits with minimizing, as it makes your advantage in weighing more obvious for the judge. This technique of weighing has a lot more to it, which we'll explore more as you go. So the example here will be an easy case. Your opponent may argue that urbanization has done more harm because it kills 4,000 people per day due to air pollution. If this is their argument, then you can respond to this by weighing it against one of your own arguments. You would ideally choose one that obviously matters more than theirs. In this case, you can mention that urbanization has lifted 500 million people out of poverty, thus leading to a better economy with better health care. Arguably, better health care for 500 million people can save more lives than those that air pollution takes. So the opponent's argument is outweighed. Here you're showing that your impact matters more because it influences more people. Lastly, when preparing for a rebuttal speech, please keep in mind that your goal is not to simply prove the other side wrong, but also to prove your own arguments correct and significant. Therefore, although your rebuttal may prove your opponent wrong, if it doesn't seem to benefit you either, avoid using it or use a better rebuttal.